Well, welcome back. If you're here, it's because you need to catch up on some information about the Civil War. So let's get it going here for you. All right. At the beginning of the Civil War, there were certain issues that needed to be taken care of, and obviously, our president at that time was Abraham Lincoln, and he opposed what was called secession. That term means that states decided that they wanted to leave the Union and create their own country. All right. So by the time Lincoln announces this, he is president. He gave his inaugural address. He said he's not going to attack the South. He doesn't believe in secession, and he really doesn't want there to be any major problems. But what happens after that is in April 1861, South Carolina attacked. They fired on the federal fort. What fort was that? It was down in South Carolina Harbor, Charleston. It was called Fort Sumter. When the South fired on Fort Sumter, they basically started the Civil War. And Lincoln, once again, did not want to be responsible for starting that. The two events you have to know here is Lincoln's election led to 7 southern states seceding. When South Carolina fired on that fort, that is what began the Civil War. So Lincoln calls for more troops to put down that rebellion, and he thinks it's going to last a couple months and will be over, so he doesn't call for too many, but he calls for enough to put down this little rebellion. After the fighting began between the North and South, 4 more states seceded, and therefore you'll find there'll be 11 states total who left. So what begins after the South fires on Fort Sumter? An event we begin to know as the Civil War. So what you have here is kind of a map outlining what's happening. After Fort Sumter, the upper South states seceded and joined the Confederacy. So the original 7 states are right down here, South Carolina being the first. Then these 4 states decided to leave after the fighting began. Interestingly enough, these are what we can refer to as the border states. So you have Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia actually left in 1863, Kentucky, and Missouri. These are states that actually had slaves that stayed with the North. They stayed loyal to the North, and therefore they will be referred to as border states throughout the war. All right. Not too much happening out here. These are just free territories that they're showing up. These are non-slave states that stayed with the North. South Carolina started it. There's Fort Sumter. 7 southern states originally seceded, and then these 4 would join. So let's get it going. There's a couple debates here about what are we going to do with this disunion, I guess you can call it, right? So Lincoln's goal was to preserve the Union, keep the country together. But there's a couple issues here. Once a state had entered the United States, does it or did it have the right to actually leave? Well, there's 2 points of view here. Obviously, if we look at the South, they do feel that they have a right to leave because the government, they claimed, was not going to protect their rights, at least the rights of the white people. And they felt that this new government under Lincoln's leadership would eventually get rid of slavery. He told them in his inaugural address he was not going to attack slavery. They weren't going to listen. So the northern point of view is pretty easy. Lincoln said, hey, no state has a right to leave the Union. No minority could act to destroy our nation or to destroy our government. And that's kind of Lincoln's point of view. So the South feel that they can leave, and the North feels that they can't, all right? Pretty clear. As we begin to move throughout the war, you should keep track or keep kind of a mindset of what Lincoln wanted to do, right? His number one goal, I can't stress this enough, was to preserve the Union, keep the country together. He's going to have a bunch of other goals and aims as he goes through, but the number one is to keep this nation as one. So what did he do? He called out state militias, increased the size of the Navy, orders a big blockade of the South, approves funds for military spending. He didn't ask Congress for permission. He acted on his own, and he just did it. Why? Well, he's the leader of the country. All right. So would you say that Lincoln is a strong leader after looking at those actions? Absolutely. All right. He did arrest a bunch of Southerners who sympathized in Maryland, Delaware, Tennessee, and Kentucky. So some of those states, he basically arrested people for really no reason at all. Okay, and by doing so, it leads us to number 3. He actually suspends the writ of habeas corpus. All right, and what that means is that you can be arrested. They don't have to tell you what you're arrested for. You're thrown in jail, and they let you out when the war's over. That's what Lincoln did. He gets some flack for doing that. I mean, it's kind of the first time any president has ever done this, but he feels that's what he needs to do to win the war. So he declares martial law and arrests thousands of people for what is now called suspected disloyalty. There's really no proof here. He just wants to make sure he can keep the country together. So all of these actions he does simply because his goal is to preserve the Union. Right? He did censor certain newspapers and arrested publishers and editors who were printing things that he felt were a little controversial and a little, they weren't really going to help him win. So basically, if you put all this together, Lincoln seemed to really hold true to his first goal, which was he's willing to do anything to keep this country together. Okay? Now, with him getting rid of people's rights and arresting people, we can ask the question. If you need that vocab for habeas corpus, feel free to pause and write that down. There's some questions that need to be answered. All right, and you can think about these, or I'm not really going to answer. These require a really some deep thought, and you can actually write about both sides, but you may be called upon to write about some of them. So let's just take a peek at them. Lincoln's actions broadened the power of the executive branch. Broadened the power, gave the president more power. He's allowed to do more. But were such actions constitutional? Some would say yes, some would say no. Did they fall within the scope of a president's war powers? Was it something that he should be allowed to do? Or was he acting more dictatorial? Was he acting like a dictator? You can argue either point here. Did the fact that some Northerners sympathized with the rebellion justify the limiting of their civil rights? So were people's rights limited, and was it justified only because maybe you were on the north side of things? And then did Lincoln set precedents, things that can be done later on for expanded executive actions? Yes, he did, that later presidents might use in questionable circumstances. So when we go back to the big question here, right? Did Abraham Lincoln broaden the power of the executive branch? Absolutely. Was he justified in doing so? That's for you to answer, okay? So let's take a peek at some other government policies during the war. And as you move through history, there's three big items that kind of took place that had nothing to do with the Civil War, but you should understand that they happened during the war, okay? So in 62, and I got to fix that, it's 1862, that's wrong. 1862, Congress passed three major acts, all right? Major sheet says 1862, that's wrong. The first was the government financed, they gave railroad companies public land grants and cash loans. They gave them money, right? The government supported the building of railroads. There was something otherwise known as the Homestead Act, right? Provided for the settlement of western lands. You got 160 acres, you had to farm it for 5 years, and after that, you build a house, you own it. 160 acres, a lot of land. This promoted people to move out west. The last was the Morrill Land Grant Act. This gave public lands to states and territories, but they had to build colleges. Well, what kind of colleges out west? Agricultural, mechanical arts, and military science colleges. So all three of those deal with settlement out west, giving the railroads land and money, giving people basically free land for a small price, and then building of colleges so we can use the land. So keep those in mind. If you need the, it's 1862, not 1962. So you got that. What's the South got to do to win? We'll go over Southern and Northern military strategies. In our last video, I know we looked at strengths and weaknesses. So what's the Southern strategy? It's not a bad strategy, but it obviously loses, right? It's called the War of Attrition. They want to attack the Union Army repeatedly, inflict casualties, and just wear them down. So if the North comes down and fights the South, all the South has to do is repel that invasion, beat on them a little bit, and hopefully they'll stop coming, and then the South would win. These Southerners absolutely wanted to get help from Britain or France. Nice strategy, never works. Britain and France never join this war. They never help the South. They never recognize the South as having their own country. So two good strategies, but neither one is going to be extremely effective. Now, we'll probably spend a little more time on the Northern military strategy. Why? It's the winning strategy. So first thing is it's called the Anaconda Plan. By who? General Winfield Scott. He was a general from the war against Mexico, and he comes up with this plan. It's going to have something to do with a snake, and it's going to be the winning plan. So the first thing is use the military resources and technology to set up a naval blockade of the South. Well, that's easy. What military resources? The North has a navy. So they're going to use their navy to blockade the South. Don't let anything in. Don't let anything out. The South can't do anything, right? Second point is to gain full control of the Mississippi River. Cut the South in half. Ulysses S. Grant actually accomplishes this in the Battle of Vicksburg early on in 1863. So the North controlled the Mississippi River. Right? Grant was then put in charge to destroy the Southern Army and all of their resources. If you take a look at the Anaconda Plan, it's nice and simple. You have the snake, it goes right around. This is your naval blockade here, controlling the Mississippi, destroy the South, make them give up, and win the war. So that's the battle plan here. And like I said, that's kind of it's going to be the winning strategy. There were heavy human costs in this war. Over 650,000 casualties. So it is the bloodiest war the U.S. has ever known. One of the reasons why that human casualties are so high is that every casualty is American, because it's, you got North fighting South, they're all American. So that's one of the reasons why the casualties are so high. So 620,000 American lives were lost, and like I said, plenty more casualties. The worst single day in the war was 1862, Battle of Antietam Creek in Maryland. The numbers were extremely high. Second deadliest day in American history. So it's a battle. The Battle of Gettysburg, 3-day battle, 50,000 dead and wounded. So it's pretty bad, right? When you look at the overall casualties, I'd like to pull this out only because it really kind of sets you up here, right? World War II, 400,000. World War I, 116, and then it really tapers off from there. Really compare that to all the other wars. It's pretty devastating to our nation. So what does happen after Antietam, though? Lincoln feels the need, and I think he's ready to issue what's known as the Emancipation Proclamation. And what he did after that battle, which was so deadly, is he said all the slaves were free in Confederate-held territories. Be very clear on this point. He did not free all the slaves. He said that all the slaves were freed in Confederate-held territories. Right? The proclamation had only a symbolic value, meaning that this proclamation actually doesn't free anybody. Right? You need to know that. The Union could not enforce it, and the actual statement itself didn't free one single slave. Just because he said it, nobody was free. Okay, why did he say it then? What's the reason? Well, a couple things. After this proclamation, more African Americans joined the Union Army, helped the Union Army achieve victory. So the North had kind of a moralistic code to what they were doing, and they got fired up, and they got some help from African American soldiers. Lincoln also adds a humanitarian, a moral objective to the war. He does feel that by war's end, he will be able to actually do that, although the emancipation doesn't free anybody. But the biggest key here, should have this bigger star here for you, by saying it, Lincoln actually is going to keep Britain and France out of the war. So you need to know that the Emancipation Proclamation is very nice, but it doesn't free anybody. All right. Once again, when you look at it, proclamation excluded more than 800,000 enslaved people living in the border states. Did not include these border states, did not include Louisiana because the North had held that already. So really, the statement said that all the slaves in these red states are free, but don't forget, these red states aren't even listening to Lincoln because they seceded and they have their own country. So it really doesn't free anybody, okay? Nice statement, though, right? After the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln issues a nice 2-minute speech after this battle. He called upon the nation to have a new birth of freedom. He called it a rebirth of freedom. But we're not going to have what? Slavery, right? Short 2-minute speech summarized the meaning of the Civil War. Said, listen, we began this country and we screwed up. We had slavery. Well, we're going to have a renewed birth. We're going to do this again, and we're not going to have slavery. Right? So if you want to read it, I mean, you can go through his language. This is 4 scores 20 years. So he's saying 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, but we weren't living up to that. So if we have a new birth of freedom, we might, right down here, he says, we might be able to live up to that. And he goes on by saying, we're going to dedicate this to a bunch of soldiers at the Battle of Gettysburg. So everyone expected Lincoln to say a whole lot more. It was 2 minutes. He was done, and he moved on. Well, the end of the war is pretty simple, right? As we continue with a couple battles. The Battle of Gettysburg was the last time the South invaded the North. After 1863, the South know they're going to lose. General Robert E. Lee fought a decisive war until he surrendered 1865 to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. So it's a kind of a meeting at the courthouse. The blue over here, the blue would be the Union soldiers, that is Ulysses S. Grant, and the general of the South was General Robert E. Lee. So he surrenders, and the war is actually over. Right? But what you need to know about is what changes on the home front. Okay, so three things. We're going to look at North, what happens on both sides, and then the South, and then you guys are free to go here. Well, what happened in the North? Pretty simple. Production in factories and farms increased dramatically. We're in a wartime economy, and we're producing wartime goods, right? Men are going to work, so women and African Americans took more factory jobs. Why? Because the men are gone, right? Women also ran farms and raised money to help wounded soldiers. So women are contributing a lot during the war effort, okay? Well, what happened on both sides? Women served as nurses, even in field hospitals. They needed to tend to the wounded on the battlefield. We talked about 620,000 casualties, right? Medicine was still primarily seen as a male profession, but women began kind of sneaking their way into that profession, right? Clara Barton, who eventually founds the American Red Cross, was met with resistance. She was a nurse. She gains the nickname the Angel on the Battlefield, and there's a nice commemorative stamp of her. In 1881, she creates the Red Cross. So if you get banged up in an accident, you're going to have to blood for you, you know. What happened down south? Well, as you can imagine, it was a little more devastating to the South. Why? They did not have the industrial support. They did not have the amount of railroads that the North had. They couldn't move supplies around. They couldn't make supplies. So they were ill supplied throughout this war, which led to their loss. The Confederate government did not have support from the other governments. So people didn't go, and they weren't able to draft as many soldiers as they thought. They were running short on food, and they certainly weren't making any money. The Northern blockade actually worked well. It left the South short on food and resources. Women in South, they took over farms, supervised slaves. They did everything. Nurses, teachers, clerks, cooks, this, that. So once again, women played a very big role in this war, right? What happens at the end of the war? The South is devastated, right? I mean, this is, look at the buildings are blown up, railroad tracks blown up. So the only thing we have to do now is simply rebuild the South. And if you stay tuned, that'll be our next video in this circuit. Hopefully you got what you need here. You should know the Union battle plan, Lincoln's actions during the war, and we'll see you soon.